On this episode of Still Loading, Sega had confusing system names before it was cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today on the show, I have a very special episode for you. I say that every episode, but I mean it even more so this time. This week's episode is a look at a really underspoken about, it doesn't get talked about enough. It's a look at a console. It's actually Sega's first game console of all time. And with me to discuss this console is my friend Bill from the Gaming and Collecting podcast. Bill, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, Josh.
Dude, thank you for coming on. I've talked to you about this off mic, and I think it's worth repeating here. You're one of the people in our podcasting sphere that is obsessed with game history as I am. There's a couple others, so I'm not trying to belittle any of you else listening. I can think of one other friend specifically who I'm literally going to be recording with very shortly. So that's the only reason why I didn't invite them on, because they're literally going to be on an episode very soon. But the reason I asked you on, because like I said, you're really into game history like I am, and this week's episode is a topic about something neither you or I have really any emotional attachment to, like any even physical experience with. At best, we've watched videos. I don't even know if there's emulators for this system. I'm sure there is. Let's be honest. I'm sure there is.
If there are, I couldn't get them working back in the day.
And we're here to discuss the Sega SG-1000. The SG-1000, for those who do not know, was Sega's first ever video game console. And the reason why we are discussing it today in the first place is because it is turning 40 this year. Not this month. This is coming out in June. It turns 40 on July 15th this year, just a little less than a month after this episode comes out. And well, actually, it'll be a little over a month for those listening on the Patreon. I don't know. Time's an illusion. It's about a month, everybody. I don't know why I'm trying to be so technical with this. So the SG-1000 came out on July 15th, 1983, and it's turning 40. And I think it warrants a conversation because it's not really known to anyone here in North America or really anyone outside of Japan. And it also got released in Australia, though I don't know how popular it was. But according to Wikipedia, it did see an Australian release date. And the second version of it, the SG-1002, also saw an release in Taiwan, of all places. And we'll get to the third iteration of that a little bit later. But the SG-1000 is super important because it is Sega's first foray into the console space. It also came out on the exact same day as a little-known console as the Nintendo Famicom, which, of course, we got to know here in North America as the Nintendo Entertainment System. So the console wars between Sega and Nintendo literally started on the same day. They both had their release. They both released their console on the same exact day, and it's kind of wild to see that this console war has been between Sega and Nintendo started significantly earlier than we actually really expected. Which is kind of why I wanted to explore the SG-1000 in this episode. And I've asked you on, Bill, like I said, you like video game history, and I said this off mic, another little behind the scenes shit, but I'm treating this episode as a challenge for both of us because it can be very difficult to discuss something like this in any capacity without being able to really get our actual hands on it. I've seen an SG-1000 in person, actually. at a convention. I've seen it in person, but I haven't. I don't even think it was really working. Like there was no games in it. I think they were just showing it,
Mm,
and so I couldn't even play it. Like we said, the emulators in general, I don't necessarily like to play an emulator for something like this because it's very hard to get a feel for the game. Like I've been playing some Sega Genesis games on an emulator for an upcoming episode, and I can't get the same feel of it. The only reason I was even playing on an emulator is to use save states so I could get through the game more quickly, and it doesn't work as well as it does on the original console. I would rather not have save states, and play on the original console because I don't have really shitty input delay.
mm.
So the SG-1000, I don't feel like I'd get an accurate experience to what it's like. So both you and I are kind of tackling this from a very macro outsider perspective.
Yeah.
But I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to our discussion with this. So before we dive into some more specifics on the console, I want to get to know your personal history with Sega, Bill. How did you since we can't necessarily relate to the console itself, I thought it would be useful to just kind of, say how we relate to the company, how we first kind of came to know Sega, and how we first kind of discovered the console wars between Sega and Nintendo, as it were, or just your first experience in general. So, Bill, what is your personal history with Sega?
So a lot of people know I'm more on the younger side of the gaming community as of, I guess, in the little sphere that we're in currently. So my history with Sega is a bit kind of like off from a lot of people's, like, because by the time I was able to know what like video games and stuff were, Sega was a shell of their former selves and they were on their way out of the
Mm-hmm.
console market by this point. So I spent most of my time as a kid like thinking Sega was just this weird company that made Sonic and a few other games. And I didn't realize they actually made consoles for like the longest time. Like I completely missed like that entire era because I was a PlayStation kid and I barely knew that Nintendo was a thing at times, other than like the Game Boy. So as for like my first discovery of like Sega's consoles, I kind of have talked about this in the past. Like back in the day, like I was a huge fan of like Classic Game Room on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and I loved watching that show. And every now and then he would like show off different consoles. And the one episode that really like stuck with me was the Sega Dreamcast episode because I had no idea what the Sega Dreamcast was. And for whatever reason, like that console just like stuck with me to the point where it was like I needed to have it. Like I had to learn more about it. And at that point, you could get a box Sega Dreamcast for like $30. Like,
Oh my God, those were the days.
yeah. So of course, my birthday was coming up at the time, and my mom, I'm a pain in the ass to get presents for. So my mom was like, "What do you want?" And I was like, "Well, there's this console called the Dreamcast. It's old, but I kind of want it." And she like looked online, saw it was $30, and was all like, "Yeah, that's fine." So I got the Dreamcast, an extra controller, a VMU, and both Sonic Adventure games. All at the time were super cheap, like because nobody cared about the Dreamcast at the time. And from then on in, like I got the Dreamcast that like for my birthday later that year, and I was hooked on the thing because I was just like fascinated by this weird console that was almost PS2 quality in graphics, but it was like it had like the vibe of like a PlayStation or an N64 at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. And from then on there, I discovered like Wikipedia and the history part of the internet, and I went on like a deep dive, just kind of looking into like all the different systems. Like I discovered the Saturn, the CD, the 32X, the Genesis, and from then on in, I kind of made it my goal to collect all the Sega consoles because Sega kind of became my like favorite company to like just kind of look into and like discover
Mm-hmm.
their weird history because Sega was a bunch of innovators that were always ahead of the curve. And
Always shot themselves in the foot.
yeah, they were like 3 steps forward, like 20 backwards, like with everything they did. And honestly, it's that I always say the Dreamcast is what started it all, and to this day, it's still probably like my one of my favorite retro consoles of all time.
It's funny that we talk about how Sega consistently shot themselves in the foot because they innovated so much. You're 100% right. But it's funny because with the SG-1000, they played it really conservative.
They
They
did.
played super conservative with its launch. Well, actually, its launch boasted a lot of games. Sega had 21 games at launch in 1983 versus Nintendo's 9. The Famicom only had 9. But we'll get into how they did end up shooting themselves in the foot, but more inadvertently. Like, Sega, in the 90s, I guess shooting themselves in the foot was always inadvertent, but they felt like they were taking gambles. Shooting themselves in the foot with the SG-1000, the way they did it, was not a gamble. It was just a miscalculation, and we'll get into that in a moment. For my personal history with Sega, I had a neighbor who had a Sega Genesis, and I've told this story before, and I'll tell it again, somewhat quickly. And maybe those who are new to the show and haven't heard it. But my neighbor had a Sega Genesis, and I fucking loved it. I was one of those bratty kids who would go over to his house just so I could be like, "Hey, can I play with your Sega?" Like, I didn't want to see them. I just wanted to play their video games. That was it. I didn't care. I wanted to play Tiny Toon Adventures, damn it, and Power Rangers, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie game, which is a great beat 'em up, side scrolling beat 'em up if you haven't played it. Uh,
I love that game.
it's so good.
Just I love it, especially because the full title, it's Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie featuring Ivan Ooze.
Wait, really? Are you serious?
I think at least the Super Nintendo version is. I'm not sure if the Genesis version also
Because
has
I
the
didn't
cat.
I didn't see the featuring Ivan Ooze thing on my Genesis cart, but I could be wrong. It's one of the things, like, maybe it's not on the cart, but it's like, the official title on the box or some shit like
Mm,
that. Who knows? But I loved it. But I normally I'd feel bad about that, but they were also the same friends and same neighbors who would literally, like, knock on our front door, show up, and be like, "Hey, our mom said we could come over."
yep.
What? Like, we didn't invite you. She's just like, "Hey, my mom said I could come over." Uh, Oh, I'm glad about that. What a weird thing. They're good people. It's funny to think back on it now. Just the brashness of kids. Um, so yeah, I loved the Sega Genesis. I had a lot of fond memories for it. In fact, when I got my first home console, I wanted a Sega Genesis. I got an N64. I did fall in love with the 64 eventually, but when I first got it, I was pissed off it wasn't a Sega Genesis because that's all I wanted. That was my favorite console because that had Sonic, that had my favorite game of all time though was Tiny Toon Adventures Buster's Hidden Treasure, which I did an episode on with my buddy Gabe Swore. 2 years ago, a year ago. I think it was 2 years ago now.
Mhm.
Maybe it was only a year ago. I don't remember anymore. But uh, one of my favorite games of all time. So I first experienced Sega as a kid when it was when the Genesis / Mega Drive was contemporary, and I really loved the system. I've since become a little bit more of a Nintendo head, but I really do love Sega for what it
Mm.
brought to the table in so many facets, not just in the home console space, but also in the arcade space. And, a real quick bit of context for it. At the time the SG-1000 came out, I'm kind of jumping all over our doc. I know, Bill, so bear with me. The time the SG-1000 came out, Sega did have more arcade clout than Nintendo. You know, up until 1983, like before 1983, Nintendo only, I think I counted it right. It was like, what, 15 games is what I counted, or something like
Yeah,
that.
something like that.
In between 1978 and 1982, Nintendo released 15 arcade titles versus in 1982 alone, Sega released 11. And then even if you just go back to 1981, they released another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They released 21 games, arcade games, between 1981 and 1982 alone. And some of them, like in 1982, Zaxxon is one of the most influential games of all time. A lot of Japanese game devs credit Zaxxon as like a huge inspiration for them. They also did, there's a Star Trek arcade game, which was a shoot 'em up. They also did Frogger in
Hmm.
1981, which was developed by Konami, but, they They're the ones that still released it, that published it. So many crazy games. Is there any arcade games you want a quick shout out by Sega from around that time?
So it's a bit topical because the race actually happened recently, but Sega's Monaco GP game is like probably one of the most interesting, like, I guess you could call it an early simulation racing game for the time. Air
Mm-hmm.
quotes on simulation because this is 8-bit we're talking about. But for the time, like those games were like super impressive, especially like in the arcades. Like Sega always had a knack for just having like super way ahead of their time, like arcade cabinets.
Yeah. They they would always go above and beyond on their arcade cabinets, and you can see it from an early time too, because like you look at the games that came out even before then, like you mentioned Monaco GP, but also they did, like this wasn't before the SG-1000, but they would eventually do like Hang On and like Space Harrier and Choplifter and all these, like I'm trying to remember. But you look at some of those old arcade cabinets and it was just impressive what they do. They would really try to use the uniqueness of the arcade to create some really truly inventive experiences that you could not do on a home console, even if you had the tech to do the graphics of it. But that's neither here nor there. That's just kind of talking. That's kind of meant to illustrate Sega's arcade clout was fucking legit. Like they
Yeah.
really, really pushed the envelope on the arcade, and they were prolific for a long time in the arcade. And that's also not surprising considering when you look at the Genesis/Mega Drive, a lot of the games that came out on it were ports of arcade titles, and even the ones that weren't, they were very arcadey in feel.
Very true. It's really weird too when you think about Sega. Like in the arcades, they were like standouts, but like for whatever reason, when it came to consoles, they just never took off in their home country for whatever reason.
It's very interesting because well, at least in this instance, we can shed a little bit more context, a little bit more light as to why possibly the SG-1000 didn't do as well as the Famicom in Japan. Before we dive into that, though, I want to just read off some of the tech specs for the system. I'm not going to go full on nerd with this. I'm not saying that I even understand all of it, but I do think it's worth talking about because to paint a picture of the context of the console, you have to understand what they put into it and how it related to its contemporaries at the time. So the CPU that the system used was an 8-bit Zlog Z80 processor, which boasted a whopping, got to do that WH sound, a whopping 3.58 megahertz. Came out in March of 1976. It was used in a lot of different arcade games, such as Pac-Man, and it was also used in the Sega SG-1000 successors, which we will get into because it's a very the SG-1000 set up Nintendo, or not, excuse me, Nintendo. Oh my God. Set up Sega in a number of ways going forward, and we'll get to that in a moment. Its video processor was a Texas Instruments TMS 9918A. It was capable of displaying 16 colors, and it was also used within Coleco's ColecoVision and their Coleco Atom computer add-on. And then the sound processor was another Texas Instruments chip. It was an SN76489. Why am I giving all these numbers? It's because I wrote them down, so bear with me. This chip was also used in the ColecoVision, as well as a lot of the home computers at the time. The TI-99-4A, which was a Texas Instruments computer, the BBC Micro, the Tandy 1000. The Tandy home computers were a pretty popular brand. I think they were pretty popular, at least
Back in the day,
back
definitely.
in the day. Yeah, no, Tandy doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't even exist anymore. If it does, I don't know what they do. And it was able to create it had four different noise or sound channels. There was 3 square wave tone generator channels and then 1 noise channel. And I like to shout out the channels because the NES sound chip is a big talking point. How you could only really create basically a chord and a beat is
Yeah.
3 notes and a beat, and it's kind of what the SG-1000 had. And the final bit of tech spec here is it had a whopping 8K bits of RAM, which is actually 1 kilobyte of RAM.
I just laugh because, oh my god, the size of one video game now is like how many SG-1000s could you fit on like a Blu-ray disc at this point?
Seriously, it's just wild to think about the fact that like, oh, you know, what is it? What it's like, what 1035 kilobytes equals a megabyte, and then 1035 megs equals a gig or some shit like that.
Yeah,
So like you multiply this by 1,000 approximately, you get 1 meg, and then you multiply that by 1,000, you're looking at what, 100,000, like a million of these
yeah.
just to get 1 gig.
Yeah, technology, the way technology marches on is incredibly fascinating. One really fun thing about all those specs, though, is you mentioned the ColecoVision multiple times there. I guess,
Yes.
like, to point this out to people, like, because obviously, I mean, obviously nowadays you could look it up on YouTube to see what the graphic capabilities of the SG-1000 are. But if you want like just an easier kind of comparison, the SG-1000 in a lot of ways is essentially its closest comparison would be a ColecoVision in terms of
Mhm.
specs because they had very similar hardware.
Extremely similar.
Mm.
In fact, I want to shout out Jeremy Parrish. He has a whole video series called Segaiden. I keep wanting to say Sega Gaiden, but it's not. It's Segaiden, Gaiden, or something. Yeah, it's hard. I'm bad at saying it. He has a whole series on his YouTube channel that really dives in deep into the SG-1000's library. There's numerous videos. He covers literally the entire SG-1000 game library. And he has retrospectives on the system. He talks about the games in really great depth. And he brought up a point in his video, and one of his things was that the SG-1000, he theorizes why the ColecoVision and the SG-1000 is so similar. And he did a little bit of digging, and he had a couple different theories. One was that the SG-1000 was actually made back in 1981 when the Coleco launched, but shelved it. Others theorize that Sega approached Coleco about distributing the ColecoVision in Japan before copying the design for their own console. Um, I think the latter makes more sense, and so does Jeremy. Jeremy says that in his videos. Like the first one, like why would you make it in 81 and just shelve it? That seems strange,
Mm.
but the latter makes a lot more sense, where Sega might have approached Coleco about distributing the ColecoVision in Japan, and then when Coleco kind of started going belly up, the Sega kind of did their own thing with the system. That would make the most sense to me, but obviously I'm not really entirely sure, and neither is really anyone, because unless you were around back then, you don't really know. But
Yeah.
that would make the most sense to me. What are your thoughts, though?
Honestly, so what's interesting about this system, another little side note is a lot of these chips that are present in the SG-1000, these chips have a very long and prosperous history with Sega going forward that we'll probably get into later. Um, and I have a feeling these were pretty stock, like for the time,
Oh
is
yeah.
my guess. And I just have a feeling Coleco was arguably the most powerful system at the time, other than the NES. And I have a strong feeling that Sega probably kind of looked towards that one. That's my guess, anyways, because it was the most graphically impressive, and I think the easiest one to work with, from what I've heard.
The ColecoVision, I mean, yes, for that generation of consoles, between the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and the ColecoVision was the most powerful. But remember, the ColecoVision also came out in 1982 in North America.
Mm,
So really, and even then, most game consoles work off of technology that's a little bit dated, usually, unless you're really trying to go for a powerhouse. But in general, a lot of game, because it was still an unproven business at the time, so they're not going to put the top, especially back then. Computer technology was so expensive back in the 70s and early 80s, so it's not like they could mass produce it cheaply. So they had to go with older hardware in order to make the system more affordable. So I mean, think about it. The Zlog 80 processor came out in 1976,
hmm
which was 6 years prior to the ColecoVision, and then 7 years prior to the Intel or the SG-1000. Imagine now, if a PS, like say Nintendo announces their new hardware, right, and they're like, we're going to use hardware that was contemporary from 2016. People would be like, what? What do you mean? Like, why would
Well,
you?
the funny part about that is it wouldn't be the
The
first
Switch,
time.
that's true, actually.
I mean, the
I
Wii is the
Nintendo
Wii
wasn't
was.
the best choice for that.
I was gonna say the Wii was basically just two GameCubes stuck together.
But even then, dude, even then, at that point, the Wii came out in what, 2006, so it was only 5 years old instead of 7. Like, if it's
Yeah,
really just a GameCube with motion controls, the GameCube came out in 2001, so even then, it's still only a 5-year gap versus 7 years. And Nintendo still isn't the best example because obviously the Switch was underpowered compared to it's underpowered even though it came out in what, 2017, and it was
yes,
still underpowered compared to the 2013 PS4 and Xbox One. So it,
yeah.
you know, Nintendo may not be the perfect example of that, but um,
To be fair
yeah,
to Nintendo, though, it's kind of working for them.
dude, it's genius. That could be a whole nother topic about like what do we want to see in terms of video game consoles going forward, because I don't give a shit about graphics anymore. Like
No,
the more realistic something looks, the more actually concerned I get, where I'm like, I don't want it to look real. I want it to be an escape from reality. I don't want it to be reality.
yeah, no, I've hit that point where like modern games just don't interest me anymore because I feel like it's just getting too. I don't know what it is about them. Like I have more fun playing like 3DO or something. So
Actually, 3DO kind of comes into the conversation, not directly, but as an example later on. But all right, let's we've already been going for a little bit. Let's dive into the topic in earnest. We've kind of danced around a little bit of the just some of the context of Sega at the time. It was an arcade giant. It was coming out on the same day as the Famicom, which the Famicom, this was a point I meant to bring up. Famicom was significantly more powerful than
yes,
the SG-1000. The SG-1000 couldn't natively support scrolling, like horizontal scrolling, the way the NES could. Additionally, a lot of the times, it's all about those arcade perfect ports, which is what the console manufacturers were really trying to push back then. And what was the biggest game at the time? One of the biggest games, it was Donkey Kong. It
hmm
wasn't the biggest, but it was. I mean, it was in 1981 at the very least. Or was it 80 or 81 that Donkey Kong came out? I think it was
I
81.
I think it was 81.
But it was so huge, and it like yeah, it was 81. Sorry, I just looked it up. But it was so huge, and so one of they would always try. People would boast like, "Oh, we got Donkey Kong at home." Well, Nintendo literally built the Famicom around the specs to play Donkey Kong, and
Mm.
so literally Sega could not compete with Nintendo at their own game at that game because Nintendo literally built their system with that in mind.
It's interesting though about like Donkey Kong was theoretically it could have probably ran on the SG-1000 because in reality the ColecoVision, one of its big sellers was it actually had Donkey Kong on it,
Hmm.
which is a little interesting in hindsight, and that's a whole nother part of gaming history that's probably better for another podcast at a different time.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying the SG-1000 couldn't run
Oh,
Donkey
okay.
Kong. It was more that like if you're looking in terms of arcade perfect ports, you
True.
had a really good port on the ColecoVision and the SG-1000, and then the basic perfect port in the NES because it was designed to do
Yeah,
that.
okay. I get what you're saying now.
So Nintendo had that up on them. So before I dive any further into this, Bill, I wanted to talk a little bit about Sega's history. We talked about its context leading up to this, but I thought it would be worthwhile going into Sega's history.
All right. So Sega, would you believe it or not that Sega actually was founded in America?
I would believe it, but I would love for you to illuminate more of it for me.
So Sega was, believe it or not, Sega dates back to 1940, and it originally founded as a company known as Standard Games.
Hmm.
And Standard Games is interesting because they were mostly they were kind of set around like the coin op, like operations back in the day, and they were actually formed in Honolulu of all places. So they weren't exactly mainland America, but they were still on American
Hmm.
soil.
Yeah.
Later down the line, they actually would change their name to Service Games around the 1950s. And Service Games was later abbreviated, taking the first two letters from both words to Sega. And Sega eventually was transferred over to Japan. And it's kind of interesting how it kind of just would pass hands until it became a Japanese company. And that's when like arc they kind of kept up with like the arcade and like slot machines and stuff. That's a very abbreviated
Yeah.
like explanation of what happened, because like if you were to look on the Wikipedia page for like history of Sega, it is massive. like like a lot of stuff happened between 1940 and 1982, which is pretty much the period of like Sega that no one really talks about, because it wasn't their real big gaming moment. It was more their formation years, which were bizarre to say the least.
I feel like a lot of pre-game history for these game companies isn't talked about enough. Like I remember I wanted to do, I had a series. Well, it never was actually a series. It was meant to be a series, but I only ever did one episode on it, called Game Industry Legend Profiles, which is a little bit clunky of a name. I would have to find a way to shorten it. But the idea was for me to look at iconic figures in game history. So I did one on Gunpei Yokoi. I wanted to do one on I'm gonna blank on his name, but the dude who founded Namco. I think it's like Yasuya Nakamura or something like that. I am Masaya Nakamura.
Yes, yep, that's it.
He actually died in 2017, which I was going to do my episode before then. So, but it was just kind of interesting that he passed away just like I think it was like a year or something after I had the idea, but I couldn't find a whole lot of information on him at the time. I actually wonder if there's a lot more now, but he he founded Namco, which was something. It was like he went to school for like shipbuilding. Like in college, he went to school
Yep.
for shipbuilding, which is just nuts to think about it. And then he created Namco, which I forget what Namco even stands for. It's like Nakamura, like manufacturing company or something
Yeah,
like that.
it's something like that. They also bought Atari at one point, like one of the
Oh,
er,
really?
yeah, the so when Atari went under, Atari Inc. went under, it was split into two companies. There was Atari Corp and Atari Games. Corp made like the hardware, and then Games made like all the arcade games.
Mm.
Corp was purchased by the ex-founder of Commodore, and that's how
Oh,
the
Trip
Atari.
Hawkins,
No, it was Jack Tramiel, I believe
Jack
was his name.
Tramiel. Sorry, there you go.
Um, After he was ousted from Commodore, and that's why the Atari line of computers started, because he turned Atari into a computer company. The games side, on the other hand, was actually purchased by Namco, and then they the history of Atari games is pretty insane as well. Like that's honestly for another that should honestly be for another episode.
Yeah.
But it's just to like kind of wrap up with that, like the company Tengen, that is
Yeah.
actually Atari Games, because Atari Corp owned the rights to use the Atari trademark for like publishing, so Atari Games could not use that, so they made Tengen as their
Hmm.
publishing name, essentially.
And that is its own thing with which actually, um, full disclosure, listeners, there's going to be a Famicom 40th anniversary episode next month. But since the Famicom obviously looms larger in the public conscious, I wanted to release it as close to its 40th anniversary as possible. 40th anniversary in Japan came out in, like I said, the same date in 1983.
Mm.
But to bring it back to Sega, you're right, Bill. There's a whole section of like gaming history that is, I should say, it's like on a technical level, it's not part of gaming history itself because it's not part of the game industry at the, for what at any point in the time. But it is interesting to look back at companies like Nintendo and like Sega before they were involved in the game industry. And Nintendo has a whole bunch of infamous deals in between, like Love
Yep.
Hotels and
Yep.
taxi service, and like obviously they started off with Hanafuda cards and all this other stuff. But that's like we said, that's a story for another day. That's a podcast for another episode, or something, an episode for another podcast. Any other things you want to highlight on for Sega before we continue on?
Just one final thing. I just find it really fascinating how these companies get their names in a lot of ways, because it's just amusing that the iconic Sega name is literally just an abbreviation of service games.
Well, and speaking of service games and Sega, the SG and SG-1000 stands for Sega Game. So they kind of keep that moniker going in one way, shape, or form as the system has gone on.
It's kind of funny how all the companies would do that back in the day. Coleco, to bring them up one more time, Coleco is short for the Connecticut Leather Company. So
I love that. Whenever I tell people that fact, is like, well, you've heard of video game console, the ColecoVision? Like, no, what is it about? I'm like, well, you won't believe this, but there's this company called Coleco. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. But you know what Coleco stands for? Oh, no, the Connecticut Leather Company. Get the fuck out of here.
Yep. And then they're more famous for making Cabbage Patch Kids, of all things. So
it's so funny to me, because I guess at the time they weren't even big in the leather industry anymore in the 70s, right? They had expanded so far into other, I don't know for sure. I haven't researched Coleco, so I could be completely off with that.
Yeah, Coleco is one of the weirdest consoles that's well known, but not one of those mega consoles that everyone loves.
See, unfortunately now Coleco and its Vision brother, Intellivision, Coleco, and have now been adapted by some greedy sons of bitches and
scam companies.
Yeah, that's a different story for a different day once again. But okay, so to move on to kind of some more of the fun facts about the system. The SG-1000 had a family-friendly variant as well that came out around the same time, called the SC-1000, which I'm assuming stands for Sega Computer, because it was a home computer based on the console. And Nintendo didn't even have this equivalent until a year later in 1984 with the Family Basic keyboard. So you could turn an SG-1000 into an SC-3000 with a keyboard add-on, or you could just buy the SC-3000 straight out of, box and all. That was the whole thing. It all came together. The keyboard add-on called the SK-1100, which I'm assuming stands for Sega Keyboard.
Knowing Sega's trends, I'd say so.
I would assume so. I know SG is the only one listeners, the SG is the only one I can confirm, but SC and SK, I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption that it's a Sega Computer and Sega Keyboard. And actually, I'm just saying this disclaimer now, just because I meant to at the top and I forgot, but I want to say it before I forget. If we get any of these facts wrong, by the way, listeners, feel free to write in kindly. Constructive criticism is good, being an asshole isn't. But Bill and I, this is not something we got to experience firsthand. So we are using this episode, and I mentioned this at the beginning, and I mentioned this off mic. It's a challenge for us. This is a learning opportunity for us, both as podcasters and as fans and amateur game historians, just to learn about a system we don't know as much as we'd like to about. So we welcome any type of corrections or enhancements that you would like to add to this conversation that Bill and I are having. But okay, yeah. So the SK-1000 or 1100, was the keyboard add-on for it, which turned the ColecoVision, or sorry, not the ColecoVision, the SG-1000 into the SC-3000, and improve the system's capabilities very similarly to what the ColecoVision did with the Coleco Atom, or the expansion model 3 for the ColecoVision, which turned it into a Coleco Atom. And just to clarify, listeners, the Coleco Atom was basically the SC-3000 version for Coleco. ColecoVision was the base console, and then the add-on was the Coleco Atom, which could turn it into a home PC.
Yes. So now, interestingly, getting a little bit more into the hardware side of things, due to its older tech, it was much less technically impressive than the Famicom. Like we said earlier, it lacked support for scrolling versus the hardware level scrolling that the NES had at the time. The sprites were also monochromatic versus the NES's ability to have 4 color sprites at once. And while not technically impressive for the time, though, it did have a lot of variety.
Yeah, the colors on the system were kind of pastels or pastelish. Like Jeremy Parrish in his videos talked about how when you play an SG-1000 game on like an SG-3000 or the Mark III, I should say, it actually had harsher colors. It went from more from pastel color to more of like a very harsh, like I forget what word he used in the video, but like instead of a pastel red, it was like a beet red type of thing, and it completely changed the visuals of the games. It wasn't good in my opinion.
Yeah.
Now, moving on a little bit, Sega, in terms of the games for the system itself, Sega had a pretty strict third-party system or third-party structure for this system. It's kind of similar to what they happen in the US, where third-party devs could develop for the system, but it would have to be published by the console manufacturer. So a lot of the games that were developed by third-party companies ended up getting published by Sega so they could get a cut of the money for every game sold, which I think is one of the reasons it didn't do as well in Japan. I mean, it's a combination thing. It's a combo between the SG-1000 being technically inferior to the Famicom, and also if you wanted to develop for it, you had to give Sega got a cut of all the game sales because it was all, they got publishing rights for everything. So that really decreased the pool of third-party devs that were willing to work with them, which on the opposite side of things, Nintendo did not have that limitation at the time, which made them more appealing to third-party devs.
The irony here is very, very interesting. So I guess like an interesting thing to point out here too, the history of Sega is very confusing because the Sega this Sega we're talking about here is not the Sega that most Sega fans know of, because
Yes.
this predates the formation of Sega of America. And Sega of America was a very different company from Sega of Japan. to the
That's
point
an
where
understatement.
to the point where they hated each other.
They really did.
Also, Sega of Europe to a lesser extent, they also didn't get along, but they were kind of doing their own thing up in Europe. But Sega of America was responsible for the hip and cool Sega that we all know and love. Sega of Japan didn't really understand why people liked Sega, as far as I'm concerned.
No, they really didn't. And it's the irony that you bring up about Nintendo is it's palpable. For those who don't know, the Nintendo in the NES era for North America. So it's funny. In the Famicom era, to my understanding, before it came over to North America, which I believe the soft launch was in like 1985, and it didn't really get released in earnest until the next year in North America. They had very little like regulations on third-party devs in Japan when the Famicom first came out, and it almost gave them their own version of the North American game market collapse originally. I don't want to dive too much into that now because that is going to be a topic for the Famicom 40th anniversary episode. But so when the NES came over to Japan, or to North America, excuse me, they added a lot of regulations, and Nintendo Nintendo's regulations in the NES and Super Nintendo era are infamous for how unfair they were to developers.
Yes.
How anti-competitive they were for literally anyone else in the industry. So it is really weird to see Sega being the one, not nearly as strict as Nintendo ended up being, but Sega being the one more conservative and more strict with this, and Nintendo being like, fuck it, make whatever you want. I don't care.
Yeah. I will say, as much as shitty as it was, the Nintendo's ideas there had a lot of merit and did make a lot of
Mm-hmm.
sense. I do think though, like they did eventually reach a point though where it was kind of like, okay, you can kind of back it off here now. But unfortunately, they did not for a long time.
Yeah, and that'll be a topic that you'll hear more about next month. Just as a little teaser for that. Um, yeah, but it is funny just to see what Nintendo became and what they were originally compared to Sega. And I really think this decision of, like I was saying, I mentioned before how they accidentally shot themselves in the foot. This was what I was talking about, where I think they were going off what the current industry trend was. And in this instance, it bit them in the butt because their competitor had a more open plan, like a more open option for people.
Mm.
Uh, so last thing I wanted to touch on before we kind of talk about some of the games specifically is the Sega is licensing. Sega licensed out the hardware specs of the SG-1000 to different companies. Kind of like, to shout out over to you, Bill, the 3DO. Because the 3DO, if I'm correct, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, it was more of a standard. Like 3DO, the company didn't make any consoles themselves. They would license out their architecture to other manufacturers.
Yes. So the way 3DO worked was the 3DO company itself designed the specs for the 3DO, like the hardware architecture.
Yeah.
They did not design. They didn't manufacture it themselves, though. They sold the rights of it off to different companies. Like I actually, so a little shout out to a podcast that's not currently active, but it should be coming back at some point. My other show, the 3DO Experience. I
Which
did a
I've
whole
been on.
yes. Great episode, by the way. Um, I did an episode of that where I discussed all the different hardware variations of the 3DO system itself,
Mm-hmm.
because 3DO actually, like a lot of developers, like manufacturers, actually bought the rights to make 3DOs. Only a handful of them actually did. And that's why the most common 3DO you'll see is the Panasonic variation.
Mm.
I will say, though, the difference probably here compared to the 3DO is obviously the hardware with the SG-1000 was pretty cheap and not the most expensive stuff to produce. The 3DO was so expensive to produce that the only way the companies making it could sell it was they had to sell it for $700, and you can understand why the 3DO did not take off.
Yeah, it really did not. And actually, it's kind of funny. You shout out that series or that other show you're doing. I treated that episode that I was on with you kind of similar to how I do this, where I don't have a lot of experience with the 3DO, but I wanted to come on the show because I like niche topics in gaming. And like the 3DO, the SG-1000 is a niche topic. Not a lot of people. I bet you actually not a lot of people are going to listen to this episode. It might be one of my lower downloaded ones, and that's fine. I don't necessarily do every topic because I know it's going to get a lot of hits. I do it because, hey, this will be interesting to talk about. And I've been really, so far, man, I've been really enjoying our
Mm.
discussion of the SG-1000, kind of learning, like adding context and like learning more about Sega as we go along with this. But yeah, so Sega licensed out the SG-1000, and only one company took the bait, which is strange considering, like you were saying, the SG-1000 was lower spec, so it would be cheaper. So it's interesting to me that more companies took the 3DO than they took the SG-1000. But I guess at that point, video games were more of a known commodity than, like in 1983 or 84 in Japan. The only company that actually bit and, licensed out the SG-1000's architecture was Tsukuda Original, and that's spelled Tsukuda. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Excuse me. Tsukuda Original. And their idea was to put Othello on it. They were the only company at the time that owned the rights, at least in Japan, that owned the rights for the Othello version of Reversi. And so they licensed the SG-1000 architecture to make a system called the Othello Multivision. And it honestly, it's kind of cool seeing the visuals of it, because they had like the system basically looks like a keyboard almost with a cartridge slot, and it allowed you to play Othello more accurately because I guess each button corresponded to a different like square to flip stuff. I don't know exactly how it worked. There was a total of 8 games for the Othello Multivision that was ever released, besides Othello itself, of course. Space Mountain, Sadnin Mahjong, Qbert. It had a version of Qbert for the system. So it's weird though, is if you think about it, this is like console inception, right? It's the SG. It's like a offshoot of, it's a bunch of original games. I shouldn't say original, unique games for a version of the SG-1000 that was not made by Sega. So it's like this weird offshoot of an offshoot.
That's so. I was gonna actually say this reminds me a lot of how like the Atari 2600 was licensed out also to a degree. Like
Yeah.
you had the Sears Telegame version, which was,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were all basically the same console, in reality, but it's kind of a similar thing. Like Atari, like there were so many different variations of the 2600.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I find that era of game history so fascinating too. Like I did a mini episode on our bonus episode on my Patreon. Shout out Patreon, $4 patrons could hear it. There was I was talking about like the Wild West of gaming and how like this is like tangentially ties into like how there's different versions of the same console type of thing, but how all the big console all the console makers, Atari and Intellivision and ColecoVision would all develop and publish games for each other's consoles. Like they would release their own games over on like Coleco had their own game development branch that was specific for developing games for the Intellivision, and vice versa, Intellivision for Coleco and Atari for Coleco, and all this other stuff. It's wild to see. Okay, so the last games that I'm going to shout out for the Othello Multivision though was Akamoto Ayako no Match Play Golf. I don't know what Akamoto Ayo. It's Ayako Akamoto's Match Play Golf. Okay, that what. Akamoto Ayako is a name. There we go. I did not know that they were a golfer. So that explains that. According to Sega Retro, the game is known for its confusing and unintuitive controls as well as unfair AI. I literally just clicked on it to make sure I could read it. The other games are Guzzler, which I'm assuming is a beer drinking game. That's how I would interpret it. Guzzler, Challenge Derby, and 007 James Bond. I'm very fascinated by that. I'm looking at like pictures that people have uploaded to the archive, to the Sega Retro archive, and it's got a really shitty version, I shouldn't say shitty, but a really like off-model version of Sean Connery as the drawing. And it's very much taken from Thunderball, it seems like, which is an odd choice considering that movie would have been 20 years old at the time that this would have come out, or close to 20. That's really funny, actually. So yeah,
was Connery even Bond at the point when this thing came out?
No.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say
1983. Roger Moore released his second to last James Bond movie, which has an incredible name, Octopussy.
Yep.
Oh my god. And actually, I want to know, does it say what year the Multivision came out? It looks like it released in 1983, and then there's apparently a second version of it that came out a year later in 1984. The second version of the Othello Multivision, the FG-2000, I don't know what that FG stands for, but brought support for a second controller, and the model can easily be identified. I'm reading this straight from Sega Retro. This model can This model can easily be identified by the fact that it has blue keys rather than the red ones, and the fact that the built-in joystick has been replaced with a directional pad. So yeah, there's some fun facts about a really niche offshoot of a niche console.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I just thought that was interesting that they license it out like it was hardware, like that you would see in, like we mentioned the 3DO, and then you would get also with the CDI. Wasn't that no? Philips made the CDI. That
Yeah,
wasn't standard, right?
I think Philips made, well, it's iffy because Magnavox made CDIs as well, but I think Magnavox is owned by Philips, so it was
Okay.
one of those kind of
I guess
situations.
I guess another company to compare it to then is or maybe not company, but brand is MSX, the MSX computers, because
Mm,
that was a standard of computer that was licensed out, I believe, by Microsoft. I believe Microsoft owned the MSX standard, and then it never really was huge here in North America, but it got big in Japan. So much so, the original Metal Gear games
yep.
were for the MSX.
A lot of Konami products came out on the MSX.
Yeah, there's a lot. That would be an interesting episode to do as well. But I have even less like knowledge. Like at least I have brand recognition with Sega in this. Like MSX. I guess Microsoft, but even then, I don't know. It seems more foreign to me.
Yeah. I mean, I literally, the only thing I know is like Metal Gear and like that one Castlevania game. So,
hmm I mean, I didn't know any of the games for this, but for some reason, because it's like Sega's first console, I thought it was interesting.
mm,
Um, the last thing to talk about before we go into games is the architecture of the system itself. We rattled off we talked about its technical specs earlier. What's crazy about the SG-1000 is that it really set Sega up for the next arguably decade in terms of hardware specs.
hmm
There's a second version of the SG-1000 called the SG-2000. It came out a year later. And it wasn't a huge upgrade, but the one after that was, and that was the Sega Mark III, which we got here in North America as the Sega Master System.
Yes. So I will say, like the SG-1000 itself, it's a very attractive looking system.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's very like, so the original model, like the original SG-1000, it's kind of like this pyramid looking like thing with like, I can't tell where the controller ports are. I assume that's them on the
I'm
side.
pretty sure they're hardwired in like the Famicom was.
Possibly. The image I'm looking at doesn't have controllers attached. It might just be a render. Um, it's very clean though. It's funny because like when you think of Sega, you think like dark and kind of like edgy looking. Like this, not so much. This is more. Honestly, this reminds me a lot of the Dreamcast. So maybe the Dreamcast was kind of a throwback.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the SG-1000 Model 2, that one looks more like a console, I'd say, that like Sega would have made. Like you can see a lot of the lines and stuff that kind of become like Sega standard. It's also not nearly as interesting looking though.
Yeah.
And then the Mark III looks intimidating, I will say.
The Mark III. Oh wow, actually I just looked at a picture. I was thinking of like a shittier version of the Master System with like that weird like curved top or whatever.
Oh, the Master System 2.
Yeah, I don't. I just think that looks dumb. The Mark III looks like something out of like a sci-fi movie from the 80s. It looks like it just looks like a computer, like a
Hmm.
futuristic computer. I actually really like how it looks.
Yeah, because the Mark III, what's funny is the Mark III had like had a lot of hardware like revisions and updates to soup it up to the point where it was actually more powerful than the Famicom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they brought over to us as the Master System, which the Master System is funny because it's sometimes referred to as the Mark IV, even though it's just a Mark III with a different
Yeah.
cartridge slot.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's funny because I for a while I thought the because Sega consoles like weren't backwards compatible for a long time. I
Mm-hmm.
thought you could play Master System games on like, well, you could play Mark III games on the Master System, but then our mutual friend Chris actually pointed out to me that it had different cartridges, and I was like, oh yeah, it does.
And to continue on with that talk of just comparing, the Master System and the SG-1000 and all this other stuff, like just kind of continue on with this trend. The reason why we say the SG-1000 set Sega up is because the architecture used in the SG-1000 is used all the way up until the Sega Genesis. So much so that like there is literally an SG-1000 processor in the Sega Genesis itself. The Genesis, it has its primary CPU as the Motorola 68,000, which
Mhm.
ran at an impressive 7.6 megahertz. But it also had the Z-Log Z80, so it was backwards compatible with the Master System, which, as we saw with the power base converter or whatever it is, that's what it was called, right? To play Master System
Yes.
games on the
So, fun fact about the power base converter. Do you know why it's called the power base converter?
no, actually.
So, if you actually look very closely at the Sega Master System, you'll notice right next to its name, it's the Sega Master System with that slash, and then it says power base. For whatever reason, like
Mm,
the console itself was known as the power base. And so when they made the converter, it
weird.
was the power base converter. I've
That sounds
always,
like something out of Star Wars.
yeah, I've always thought that was a weird choice, like why they went with that. Um, because it's really funny because the power base converter literally has no actual hardware in it. It is literally just a pass through because
Yeah, it yeah.
it's because the Genesis cartridge slot did not match the Master System slash SG-1000 cartridge slot, so they had to make a workaround. But the console itself is one of the few consoles out there that is truly backwards compatible with its predecessor.
Which is just so cool to see. Now, I do think it would be really funny. I want to see a clip now of someone taking Star Wars, and it's like Luke Skywalker going, "I need to go to Tashi Station to pick up some power base converters." That needs to be a thing on like Sega forums somewhere. It has to be. Uh, sorry, I apologize for the dumb joke, but
No worries.
um, yeah, no, the architecture of the system set up Sega for the arguably the next decade. Obviously, the Sega Genesis went for a good long while before. I guess if you count the Sega CD as a separate console, that came out in '92 or
Mhm.
something.
But even then,
Um,
that's still piggybacked off the Genesis.
that still piggybacked off the Genesis exactly. So never really got the Genesis, whatever, the Genesis
Mega
true
drives.
successor. Yeah, the Mega Drive's true successor until the Saturn. But yeah, so that's all that I have in terms of fun facts to talk about the system and just kind of go through it. Bill, is there anything you would like to add before we kind of go into some of the games?
So one thing that I actually did want to point out was the controller for the
Mm,
SG-1000. The original controller was like a pretty typical Atari style joystick.
with a button, I think two buttons on the side, right?
Yes,
At
and
least one.
it looked really uncomfortable and not fun to use because I hate joysticks like that. But the um the Model 2 and Mark III used what essentially is an NES style D-pad, like two button controller, although no pause button because I guess pausing on the console is cooler or so. I don't know.
Hmm. I never understood that either.
I just always thought the early days of gaming, they still were learning.
Yeah, that's how I always chalk it up. I find it amusing seeing that though.
Yeah, it's funny though because like I look at the S, it's kind of what separates the SG-1000 Model 1 from the Model 2 version is like the Model 1 had that really old style joystick thing, and then they moved on to a more modern controller that like
Hmm.
everybody like knows and loves at this point.
Yeah, I think that was a smart choice because it looks. I mean, that came out in '84, so the Famicom would have already kind of. They probably saw the Famicom and was like, "Oh, okay." I mean, Sega did a lot of reacting after the launch of the SG-1000 because even though I was saying before, it wasn't as successful. I wouldn't quite say it was a flop because it wasn't a flop. It actually sold better than they were expecting it to sell. The SG-1000.
Hmm.
So it's not surprising that they made like a successor to it, but it they definitely took a lot of lessons from their competitors because obviously, as you just mentioned, they have the D-pad in the SG-1002, clearly an inspiration taken from Nintendo. And then
Mhm.
even with their licensing out the hardware for like the Othello Multivision, where it was clearly influenced by MSX because that's what they did to get their system out there. They didn't make any consoles themselves; they just licensed out the architecture. Um, so Sega learned a whole lot between
Mhm.
SG-1000 and the SG-1002, and I guess the SG-1002 was kind of like their way to refine all the mistakes from the first one, almost like DLC for a
Yeah.
console version. It's almost like it's instead of like a DLC or like an update for your game, like a patch for your game. They're like, well, here's a patch for the console, but they couldn't. There was no internet, so they had to literally just ship out a whole new system with some pretty substantial updates, including, I
Mhm.
believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, it added the ability to do the little cards. You know what I'm talking about? The
I
what are they?
believe those were added with the Mark III, I wanna say?
Were they? Because I see in the picture for the SG-1002, it looks like to be a slot, but I guess you know what, I'm probably wrong with that. Yeah, they added the card slot to the Mark III.
Yeah.
Um,
What's also interesting too is like you kind of think about it, because as we said earlier, the SG-1000 and the Famicom came out on the same day.
mhm.
I like to think because Nintendo was very revolutionary with the D-pad at the time because at the time no one really knew like how to control these games. That's why we had like wacky controllers like the Intellivision controller, the ColecoVision phone
Yeah.
thing, the Fairchild Channel F and its Snicker bar looking controller. Um, but what I assume is they saw the success of the Famicom's controller and they refined for the later revision and just changed over to the a more traditional controller when they realized that was going to be the future of gaming.
Most likely, and that's what I thought too. Um, yeah, I don't. Is there anything else you want to talk about though before we move on to games and start wrapping up with the? Well, we're going to wrap up with games and then, of course, go into some final thoughts. But is there anything else on the console itself you'd like to talk about?
I don't know if you're going to talk about it in your Famicom episode or not, but you know the reason why the D-pad on the Master System slash SG-1002 kind of sucks.
Well, it's because Nintendo has a patent.
Yes,
They
and
literally, yeah.
they could not use the same design, and they didn't have. I'm assuming didn't have enough time to think of an alternative, like they did with the Genesis, which is why the Master System had that really awkward like square D-pad that barely worked.
Yeah, D-pad. I don't like the Master System D-pad all that much.
No,
It rolls really awkwardly.
it doesn't have a ball pivot, which is why it doesn't work right because the whole thing with the D-pad, how Nintendo's worked so well was it was essentially a piece of plastic on a ball pivot that would hit the four buttons.
Hmm.
And the what I think is hilarious to me is like Nintendo's was the ball pivot went down first, then the plastic piece, and then the outer shell. The way that Sega got away with it on the Genesis was this is genius because it's literally the sneakiest thing ever, but it's perfectly legal. They did the controller and then they put the ball pivot in the actual plastic piece and then they put the shell on. So it's just different enough, but it does the same exact thing so that it
It's
wasn't
legally
violating.
different, which is the best kind of different.
Yep. And if you want to go even farther, like the reason why Sony got away with it, because even in like the PlayStation era, Nintendo's patent was still good. The way Sony got away with it was they stuck their D-pad underneath the plastic shell, and that's why
Hmm.
the iconic PlayStation D-pad is the way it is. It was to get around Nintendo's patent,
That's
and that's why Microsoft until recently couldn't figure out how to make a D-pad.
it's it's wild to me. Nintendo has done so many things to like both simultaneously save the game industry and fuck it up. It's kind of amusing to. It's kind of I get it. I'm like that's not even like me being angry. It's amusing to me.
Yeah, Nintendo is funny like that. I mean,
That'd be.
I
Sorry, go
like to
ahead.
give all the companies. I was just gonna say I like to give all the companies crap because they're all kind of equally shit these days. But
Oh yeah.
um, it's funny just to look at some of the like sneaky, like conniving shit they would do in the background just to screw each other over.
I mean, especially Nintendo now. They just this might date the recording session, but they recently shut down the Dolphin emulator.
They did. Apparently, there's more info coming out about that. That's kind of making Nintendo not look as bad. I haven't done as much research on it yet, so
Mm,
it's one of those things where it sounded bad at first, but now it's like there's more info coming out that makes it sound not as bad. So
yeah. Okay, then I will hold judgment. I will withhold judgment, excuse me, until I can find a specific, until I hear more. But let's dive into the games now. I I'm not going to list off every single SG-1000 game, though there is not like a huge library to look at. I did write down a handful of games that I wanted to call out. I want to first start off with one. They're the port of Sega's own game. Their Donkey Kong clone, Congo Bongo.
I love that name so much.
I do too. uh, it's just their port of their own game. It's their own game, Bill, is
Yep.
wildly different from what the original version is.
Yes. See, when I see Congo Bongo, I kind, the meme like, can we go have Donkey Kong? And it's like we have Donkey Kong at home, and it's like Donkey Kong at home.
Yep.
That's kind of what I think of when I see Congo Bongo.
It was an admirable attempt by them to like recreate it. Where they like, what if we made Donkey Kong isometric? I'm not saying it's as good
It's
as Donkey Kong, but it was admirable.
it's actually a really fun game. It's just the SG-1000 version is like, oh my god, like what is this?
They made it a 2D side scroller.
Yeah.
And the dumb thing is the SG-1000 could do isometric
Yeah.
stuff. Like there's similar hardware that was contemporary at the time that could do isometric visuals. So why did they decide to so drastically change it? I actually kind of like the visuals of the SG-1000 version of Congo
Mm.
Bongo. I'm not saying it's a better game or a worse game because I haven't really played it, but I kind of like the visuals, but it's not what why it's not even close to a port.
Well,
It's basically
it's
like it's kind of like how games used to be different. You release the game on the Genesis and the Super Nintendo and they'd be vastly different.
mm. Yeah,
That's what
like
it makes me think of.
it's funny because the arcade version actually looks pretty impressive for the time. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't know this was a Donkey Kong clone, like looking at it, like it could pass as an original idea, even though it's kind of obvious. When you look at the SG-1000 port, though, this just screams like Donkey Kong.
But a
Although I do
weird
I do
version
like
of it at that.
it's like flea market bootleg Donkey Kong kind of. I do like the Congo Bongo sprite. I kind of vibe with that.
I almost wonder, like I want to go play Donkey Kong. We have Donkey Kong at home, and then you go home and it's Congo Bongo. I want to play Congo Bongo. We have Congo Bongo in the basement, and you go down to the basement, and,
And it's
this is
this.
Congo Bongo, and it's just this. Um, I had to shout that out. I also want to shout out Girls Garden, um,
Mm,
which I jumped down a little bit on our notes, I know, but I want to shout this out. This was the first game programmed by Yuji Naka, the first game that he's credited with. Yuji Naka and music composed by Hiroshi Kawaguchi. Hiroshi Kawaguchi is a famous composer for Sega. He's still with Sega. In fact, he did the music for Sonic Frontiers, which came out in 2022. But
mm.
he's probably more famous for doing the music from Outrun and Fantasy Zone and Afterburner and Space Harrier and Hang On. He also did the sound work for a game called Dragon Wang, which our friend Chris and Shane over at Retro Hangover did a whole episode on. So
I
if you
wonder
want to learn
why.
about Dragon Wang, go check out the Retro Hangover podcast. They did a whole episode on it with Corey from My Life in Gaming.
That sounds like a retro hangover game.
Right. The whole premise of Girls Garden is you play as a girl who is collecting flowers for a boy you like. Isn't that adorable?
Yeah. It's kind of it's really funny, like in hindsight, when you consider Yuji Naka completely went off the deep end, like in recent years. It's like, oh my, like what happened to this man? Although apparently he was always kind of a prick to work with, but that's not here or there.
Apparently. Bill, so I don't take everything. I want to throw it over. I was going to say I want to shout it out to you, but let me change that. I want to throw it over to you. What are some games you want to highlight?
So another big one that's very important for the time was obviously Zaxxon. We had mentioned earlier,
Mm,
and Zaxxon is probably one of the most impressive like games for the time, and probably one of the biggest like influences on like arcade shooters in general.
yeah, I mean it was huge. I I believe Jeremy Parrish, the guy that I shouted out before for his fantastic Segaiden video series, he talks about that a lot. How like if he when you look up a lot of game developer interviews and stuff, like everyone's like, "Oh, Zaxxon," like I was influenced by this. Like every game dev really seemed to be influenced by the game. So it it had a port of it, and it's a worth. I mean, I think it was one. I shouldn't say. I don't know if it was the first port of it, but it was a port of it. So it's definitely worth at least touching on due to its significance in game history.
Mm. Another game that was kind of important too was Flicky, which was a game that retroactively kind of became part of the Sonic series, like way down the line.
Did it really?
So the Flicky is like the little birds that you actually rescue in
Yeah.
Sonic the Hedgehog.
Oh, okay. That's kind of funny. I can see that actually with the movement of the birds and you rescue the animals. I can see that now. Um, for me, another game I want to shout out there's two I want to shout out real quick. Actually, yeah, there's so many. I wrote down a bunch. This one's going to be real quick. I'm going to shout out Cubert for this, not because it does anything significant, but because when he jumps up the steps, his nose looks like a dick, and I thought that was funny. So I wanted to have all the listeners imagine Cubert dick, right?
Don't look that up.
Don't look that up. Please don't. Make sure you have private mode on if you do. Oh my god! Actually, what I wanted to shout out was Loretta no Shozu, which means Portrait of Loretta. It was a Sherlock Holmes point-and-click adventure game, and it was actually the last game to ever be released for the SG-1000 in 1987 is when it came out,
Mm.
and it was the largest game on the console in terms of file size, boasting a whopping, there's that WH again, a whopping 128 kilobytes. Which is I love looking at like the specs and file sizes for games back then. It's wild what they could do with such little space.
Mm. No, totally.
And the last one I'm going to shout out, not the last one, but the next one I'm going to shout out before I throw it back over to you, if you have any others, of course, Bill, is Rockin' Bolt. Rockin' Bolt, I like once again, listeners, I've not played any of these games, at least not the Sega SG-1000 versions, but the Rockin' Bolt, I've never heard of this game before, but it's kind of like a platform puzzle game, like a puzzle platformer, where there are these moving platforms, and it's kind of like a maze, maybe even a bit of a maze, where your objective is to get over to like the other side of like the screen, and you can jump from screen to screen, not physically jump, but like you move your character from one screen, kind of like how Legend of Zelda does, where it pans over and it's a whole new screen.
Mm.
But there's no panning; it just kind of jumps over. But the objective is to bolt down the moving tiles that you encounter. So you need to bolt them down in the correct place so you can progress through this like maze type of thing. So it's just these platforms that are just moving left and right or up and down, and you can bolt them to the floor or bolt them in place so they don't move. So if you bolt one at the wrong spot, you may have to find a way to get back to it and unbolt it so you can let it move for a little bit and then rebolt it again when you get to the right spot. I thought it was a really interesting game that I've never really seen a puzzle game quite like that before or since, and I'm sure there's probably some others that are out there that I've just never heard of, but I've never seen it, and it seems really interesting to me. I'd be very curious to give this game a shot because it seems like a decent puzzle platformer.
No, it looks cool. Nah, I think other than that though, a lot of the games are pretty standard. Like there's a lot of arcade ports. Like there's a port of Space Invaders. Like there's Galaga. A lot of games that were available in other systems for the time.
Yeah, I mean that's Sega's bread and butter, arcade ports and whatnot. Then I guess to start wrapping it up, I'll just shout out a couple more games, and we can go into some final thoughts. I want to shout out Exerion, which was kind of a Galaxian looking clone. It had some proto parallax scrolling on it, which I thought was kind of ahead of its time. I could be wrong, but once again, it was impressive to me to see it's impressive to see parallax scrolling on a home console. Like, people are impressed when they see it in NES games, and this is hardware that's older than the NES and arguably had less, like, not only older, but the NES, its life cycle was expanded by adding different chips into the cartridges. So this system didn't, I can't say for certain, I would assume did not have the same benefits that the NES had in that regard. There's a Golgo 13 game, which is nothing to really shout out specifically, but it's based off a popular anime property, one which that I kind of want to really get into because I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about it somewhat recently. I already talked about that. The last game I want to shout out is Zoom 909, which was an arcade game. And this port, it was super ambitious, and it's kind of like a little bit of a Star Fox-esque game. Like, it got the camera angle of of a Star Fox game, where you control a ship and the camera kind of views it from behind and you shoot enemies. And it's not necessarily 3D like Star Fox was. It's kind of almost seems like I don't think it was in this system, but like the superscalar technology that a lot of Sega arcade games had. It kind of reminds me of that. But it also had multiple different gameplay styles. There was a top-down shooter section, the Star Fox style space combat that I mentioned before, and then there's a Star Wars style trench run, which I thought was kind of cool. So yeah, I mean, that's about all I have for in terms of games. I just wanted to shout out a couple games that while researching this episode, I found were interesting and I thought were worth bringing up. So to get into the closing thoughts for this episode, I want to ask you, Bill, what do you think the SG-1000 did for Sega in the long run? I have a couple thoughts already on it, but I'd like to hear from you. What do you think the SG-1000 did for Sega in the long run, and does anything stand out about the system to you?
Well, I mean, you can see a lot of like the building blocks of what Sega would become, and I feel like this system was definitely like the perfect like foot in the door for Sega as a company.
I agree. I definitely agree.
Because it definitely has that Sega kind of like feel to it, like that, like this is different than Nintendo, but it's still a gaming console, so it just like screams like Sega. Like it's like the anti-Nintendo in a lot of ways.
I feel like Sega has always been that too, and it's really hard to kind of put your finger on what makes a Nintendo game feel like a Nintendo game, what makes a Sega game feel like a Sega game. And I genuinely, it's hard, I guess on a base level, Nintendo is cute, Sega is cool, quote unquote. I'm not saying that's a perfect description for it by any stretch, but Sega has always kind of seemed to go for that, especially even in their arcade games. But yeah, for me with the SG-1000, it set up Sega for the next 10 years, not only in its architecture, but it helped get its foothold into the home console market. It was something where they were very conservative with the launch, and as much as it helped make the system not as popular as the NES, I don't even think with all their developer restrictions the third party restrictions that they had, I don't think it would have saved the system compared to the Famicom. The Famicom was more powerful, and obviously you had, just like a year or two later, you were going to have Super Mario Bros. Come out. So nothing was going to save the SG-1000, but I think they were still kind of smart to kind of be conservative with their estimates. Like they were surprised at the success of the system by all accounts, and they treated it very, quietly. You know, they didn't try to make a big stink about it. It seemed, from my perspective, I should say. I can't say for certain, but it didn't. You know, like they were just kind of, they released it, they let it do a modest amount, and they used it as a really big learning tool. They really used it as a way to learn, like, okay, what worked and what didn't work. And you saw that immediately with the revamp of the SG-1000 with the SG-1002 and changing the D-pad. And then even, you know, allowing the same year the SG-1002 to come out, you know, they allowed licensing out to the different companies like MSX did. So it's I think Sega, what defines it to me is just they were always trying things in the console space. They were always trying to do different things, and whether it worked or not, it it's, you know, arguably it only really worked once with the Genesis, but I mean, but you know, not to say that the other systems were bad or failures, but by comparison, they didn't do well. Sega had to get out of the console manufacturing business because they kind of kept doing crazy things with everything.
Yeah.
And I really do think that this system kind of set them up for it, but not necessarily on purpose. Like, I don't well, let me put it this way. The Sega you see in the 90s, I can see hints of here with the rapid changes, you know, like making changes off the fly. They release a console and then a year later, like, here's another version of it. Buy this now. Like, that's, you know, that's something straight out of the playbook that you would see with like the 32X and the Sega Saturn. Like, here's two different 32-bit consoles coming out within like months of each other.
Yeah.
And it's just a silly thing, but you can kind of see that with how they handled the SG-1000. They released 3 versions of the same fucking console, when arguably you could make the argument they should have just done the SG-1000, skip the SG-1002, and just go straight to 3. But they were cautious with at least the first one. I can't say as much for the SG-1002, but, you know, they were cautious with it, and then they really went further in with the Mark III, aka the Master System, and obviously they went hog wild with the Mega Drive / Genesis. And then we get the Sega we know and love from the 90s.
I think the best way to describe Sega is they were always like 2 years ahead of their time.
Except for here, where they were like 3 years behind.
Yeah, they caught up quick though.
They really did. Yeah, so that's all. I think that's it. I think that's a good place to stop for this episode. Bill, do you have anything final to add before we go to the plugs?
Well, I guess if you're interested in getting an SG-1000, you can easily find them on eBay, and they generally go for around $200 to $250. What you get with them is kind of up in the air, but there you can find them. They're not like super rare.
That's good to know. I might actually have to pick one up at some point. Yeah, so that's our little retrospective on the SG-1000. This was a lot of fun, Bill. Thank you so much for joining me on this, man. I was really, I said it off mic, and I wasn't really quite sure what we were going to do for this, but I'm really pleased with how this turned out. Just kind of going through different elements of the system and talking about a few tangents here and there, and then of course talking about the context leading up to the release of the system, and of course some of these crazy games. So seriously, man, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun. Where can everybody find you online, and what would you like to promote?
Well, thanks again for having me on, Josh. Like, I know I say it every time I'm on, but like, you were like one of my biggest inspirations for starting my own podcast. And I guess like where people can find me. So I run a couple places. I have my gaming blog on Instagram, The Barber Who Games. That's where I post a lot of my collection. Kind of slowed down there a bit, but I still post usually once a day. As for the podcast, I am one of the 2 hosts of the Gaming and Collecting podcast. It is a gaming and anime based nostalgia podcast I host with my sister Alex, where we talk about a whole bunch of different topics, including recently we did a whole episode on Stardew Valley, which Josh actually guested on.
I did.
Alex couldn't catch a tuna. It got very deep at one point. I also have the 3DO experience. It's currently on hiatus because a number of reasons, mostly because I'm trying to move to a house. So maybe after I get that all settled, I'll be able to finally sit down and get that relaunched. But for now, that's going to sit on hiatus. And the GNC podcast releases every Saturday. And you can find pretty much all the links on Linktree /The Barber Who Games.
All right. And as usual for me, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StillLoadingPod on all of them. If you want to email me, you can email me stillloadingcontact@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can do it in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy. And I like feeling warm and fuzzy. So please do that. But if you want to support the show monetarily, if you like what you heard and you want to support me and help me do more of stuff like this, patreon.com/stillloadingpod for $1 a month. You'll get all the episodes a few days earlier at a higher bit rate, as well as access to patron roles on the Discord server, and also you get voting rights. You get voting rights to help choose future topics for the show. At the time this is coming out, actually in a couple weeks, there's going to be the next patron poll episode on 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors. I hope I said that in the right order. It's either, I think it's 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors. It's some semblance of those three things and nines, but that's going to be the next patron poll topic. So if you want to vote in another one, this is a perfect time to sign up because there will be a poll happening very shortly. So very shortly. That's all at the $1 level. At the $4 level, you get everything I mentioned before, plus access to 2 bonus episodes every month. And there's over how many of them now? There's a lot now. Just go check it out. There's a lot of good shit out there. And then for the $5 level, you'll get everything at the previous 2 tiers, plus access to Still Bonding, or whatever I end up calling it after I finish this series. It is my James Bond podcast where me and some friends bond over 007. And those episodes are hella long. They're at least 2.5 to 3.5 hours. So if you want a shitload of content for $5 a month, you're going to get all of that. I believe the time this episode comes out, it's going to be very close to when we release The Spy Who Loved Me, which is the 8th Bond movie. If I'm math, 6, 7, 8, 9. Actually, the 10th Bond movie, I believe. So we're getting up there. So yeah, that's all over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. But of course, the most important shout out is the Bit by Bit Foundation. The Bit by Bit Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to put video games and video game consoles in the hands of kids receiving inpatient care at hospitals. So if you want to support them, go to bitbybitfoundation.org and consider donating. That is all the time I have for you today. Bill, once again, man, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for the compliments. I'm bad at receiving them, but I'm honored that whatever the hell I do with this show somehow inspired you. So thank you for that. That means a lot. And seriously, everyone, go check out the Gaming and Collecting podcast. I recently listened to their episode on Bill going over his most valuable games in his collection, and I know I can hear the frustration in your voice, but I'm not going to lie. Alex, your sister being the chaotic neutral of the show, is endlessly enjoyable. Just hearing you desperately trying to keep it on the rails. And meanwhile, Alex is like, you apologize to Lizzie McGuire.
I don't know where she gets it from. It's like random sometimes.
Oh, it's so funny. So yes, go check out the Gaming and Collecting podcast. But that is all I have for you today. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you all next time.